Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States. Episode 4.36, The Declaration of Independence. On June 7th, 1776, when Richard Henry Lee stood and urged that the Continental Congress consider independence for the colonies, he set in motion a process that had really been happening for months. Throughout our colonies, decisions were being made on just what to do, as popular support for independence grew. Over the course of the previous year, and really the past few months, it had become clear to everybody that reconciliation was not going to be possible, and that the only way to move forward, the only way to begin to restore something resembling order, was going to come through independence. Today, we are going to look at two things. First, we are going to be looking at the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, and then we will conclude the episode by looking at the arguments made both in favor and against it. Now, as a quick note for today, along with this episode, you will also notice that I have posted an addendum episode. Unsurprisingly, we are going to be referencing the Declaration a lot in this episode, so I thought that it was best to upload a reading of it. So if you want to hear the full document, make sure to check out that extra supplement episode. Following the motion by Richard Henry Lee, the Congress agreed to put the matter aside and return to it the next day for arguments. By this time, opinions had largely changed, even amongst those more conservative members who had previously resisted the idea of independence. By the time that Richard Henry Lee stood up and made his motion, it was apparent to everybody that independence was now essentially inevitable. Efforts towards reconciliation with the British were looking dire, if not outright impossible, and independence seemed to be the only available option. Still, however, the situation was not an outright fait accompli. Significant debates remained, and after the debates on the 11th, people recognized that Pennsylvania and Maryland, at a minimum, were still not fully on board. Now, recall from our previous episode that we know the situation in Pennsylvania is going to very rapidly evolve, and that within a few weeks, resistance inside of the Pennsylvania camp will begin to soften. However, on the 11th, that process was still in its very early phases. Recognizing that independence was going to happen, the main argument of those more moderate members shifted its axis away from the now delusional hope of reconciliation, and instead towards a question of timing. The argument of this group, led largely by John Dickinson, was that declaring independence without some kind of impetus from the people would be improper. They pointed out that, thus far, the moves from Congress had been reactive rather than proactive. In other words, why don't we wait until events force our hands? They argued that before anybody goes out and tries to secure allies, wouldn't it make more sense to wait until after a major victory? Congress decided at this point that the best move would be to shelve the debate until the beginning of July, specifically July 1st, so that everybody could fully prepare for what was surely going to be the most monumental decision in the history of the colonies. In the event that independence was decided upon, Congress did not wish to waste time and appointed a 5-man committee to take up the job of drafting a proposed Declaration of Independence. This group consisted of Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert R. Livingston. This group was overall a representative body of the colonies. From New England, you had John Adams and Roger Sherman of Connecticut. Franklin represented Pennsylvania, Livingston represented New York, and hence spoke for the middle colonies. Thomas Jefferson was a Virginian and represented the southern colonies. The drafting of the Declaration fell primarily onto the plate of Jefferson, who had in the past shown himself to be a talented writer. There is a famous anecdote from John Adams that the decision on who should draft the Declaration was essentially down to himself and Jefferson. Adams claimed that he declined the opportunity to write the Declaration in favor of Jefferson for several reasons, including that Jefferson was a Virginian. Jefferson was the better writer, and that Adams was generally seen as being obnoxious. Historian Pauline Maier, in her book American Scripture, points out several key questions, however, about this claim. John Adams did indeed make these claims, first in 1805 and then again in 1822. However, this is 29 and 47 years after the events took place. Adams' own diary never mentions this conversation, nor does any other contemporary piece of evidence support John Adams' claims. Adams was likely correct, however, in the idea that having a Virginian write the Declaration was a good idea. As had long been the underlying theme, it was important that the Declaration be something representative of all the colonies, and not just a document coming from the more radical New England colonies. Likewise, Jefferson was seen as being the most talented writer in the Congress, aside from John Dickinson, who, for obvious reasons, was not about to draft the Declaration of Independence. Franklin, a talented writer in his own right, spent much of June 1776 sick, and thus was ruled out from being the author. While we know that Franklin would have a role as an editor of the Declaration, it is also believed that he was frequently absent from the meetings of this Committee of Five. Reasons aside, the primary job of drafting the Declaration was going to be Thomas Jefferson's. Jefferson's work on the Declaration was not made up of entirely original work either, but rather critical portions of it tended to borrow heavily from other works. Now, before you start sending me emails about accusing Jefferson of plagiarism, hear me out. First, much, though certainly not all, of what Jefferson borrowed came from his own previous works, specifically from the preamble to the Virginia Constitution. He likewise took heavily from George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights. From there, we find a heavy influence from John Locke, helping round out the work. Jefferson's adoption of the works of others is not a wholly surprising development. We need to understand that in June 1776, he, as well as the other 4 committee members, were under an enormous amount of time strain. The draft of the Declaration was due at the end of the month. Jefferson was likewise aware that he needed to leave enough time in there for editing as well. Lee did not even make his motion until June 7th, meaning that Jefferson only had about 3 weeks to draft the single most important document to that point in the history of the colonies. Plus, it is not as though this was his only responsibility. Jefferson was not sequestered away in a room somewhere in Philadelphia, but rather he was still having to attend his regular functions and committees as a congressional delegate. Despite these challenges, Jefferson did prove to be up to the task, and submitted his draft of the Declaration on June 28th, although we do know from John Adams that even earlier drafts were completed within days of him getting the assignment. More than just reusing statements as a matter of efficiency. In the minds of Jefferson and his contemporaries, liberally borrowing statements would have not been something seen as being amiss. Jefferson was, at least in theory, writing on behalf of all of the American colonists who had long suffered under the perceived despotism of George III. As Jefferson's biographer, Dumas Malone, explains, Jefferson was not terribly concerned with where the ideas in the Declaration of Independence were coming from, because they did not belong to him. They belonged to all of the colonists, and, in the case of the more grandiose statements of rights, to all of mankind. As he was attempting to portray the feelings of the American people in the Declaration, the source of the specific ideas was largely inconsequential. What I want to do now is move through the Declaration and look at some of the more critical parts of it, and how it would evolve from the initial draft to the final product that we all know today. I want to remind you that I posted a supplement along with this episode that includes a reading of the Declaration. I'm also going to go ahead and include a link to the text of the document in the show notes for today. So, before we dive in here, I strongly encourage you all to pause the episode, go listen to either my reading of it, or go click the link in the show notes and go read it yourself. But I think you'll get much more traction out of it if the document is fresh in your mind. Today, we know the Declaration largely for its inspirational opening paragraph. The line, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." This is something that is ingrained in the heads of American school children from a young age. For most people in the United States today, it is these paragraphs, Jefferson's prose laying out the opening statement to the Declaration, that are the most universally remembered and celebrated. The middle section, the indictment listing out the reasons for independence, is often much more of an afterthought. That, however, has not always been the case, and certainly it is not how Jefferson and his contemporaries would have viewed the matter. At the time of the drafting, it was those specific allegations that were seen as being the most critical component of the Declaration. Although Jefferson was relatively unconcerned with the source of the arguments that he was using, be they his own, George Mason's, or John Locke's, he felt that his primary job with the drafting was to set the overall tone of the document. Jefferson therefore took great pains in the organization of the Declaration and determining how it would come across to readers. When Jefferson wrote about the idea that all men are created equal, he was citing to the enlightened thinkers of the time. The idea that Jefferson was expressing here was that no single person, by the nature of their birth, had any special rights or privileges. This idea is something that went back to John Locke, and was something often repeated just months before in Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Jefferson's argument in the Declaration is that all authority ultimately comes from the people, and that inheritance as a matter of being a birthright does not legitimately give a single individual rights over another. In the case of the American colonies, George III had violated the rights of the colonists, and therefore he had sacrificed his right to be the sovereign over the American people. As the ultimate power resided in the hands of the people, they held the right to take it back if need be. Critically, though, as Pauline Maier states, the Declaration is always rooted in its ability to establish something new. The Declaration is not a call for anarchy. Rather, it is the complete opposite. The arguments for independence, as we discussed in our last episode, were wrapped in arguments that independence was a necessary precursor for re-establishing control. Jefferson would echo this in the Declaration, with his argument being that it is the right of the people to separate from Great Britain in order to establish a new government. In other words, the right to be governed always belonged to the people. Here, the people were simply taking back that original grant of power and changing the system. In this way, the Declaration remains firmly rooted as a device for control, a way that Americans could establish a legitimate government without having to subject themselves further to the machinations of George III. Jefferson further realized that regardless of the argument that independence was a method whereby to reestablish order, it was an undeniably radical move. If part of the goal of independence was to give a basis for foreign alliances, it was going to be important that Jefferson justify the decision of the colonies to break with Great Britain. Thomas Jefferson explicitly states that long-established governments should not be replaced for light or transient causes. He quickly follows this up to establish that the cause of the United Colonies certainly was not for light or transient causes, and describes the American struggle with the king as a long train of abuses and usurpations, with the object of subjecting the colonies to despotism. Critically, what Jefferson is establishing here is that governments should not be overthrown just because, or for small insults, but only as a method of last resort. As Jefferson moves into the specific charges against the king, he uses these lines to set the stage for the lengthy middle paragraphs of the Declaration. The middle, and longest, section of the Declaration is the lengthy indictment. Here, Jefferson lays out the argument for independence in the form of an indictment against the king. Through the course of 27 specific allegations against the king, Jefferson explains to a candid world the reasons why the Americans were now wanting to break with their monarch. For Jefferson and his contemporaries, this was the most important section of the Declaration, as it is what was justifying their actions. Among the allegations, there are several which are easy enough to understand. Claims of taxation without their consent, the quartering of troops, trade restrictions, and inciting frontier violence with the help of the native tribes are all unsurprising claims. While those allegations are easy enough to point to examples of, elsewhere in the Declaration this becomes a bit more difficult. Thomas Jefferson needed to justify what the colonies were doing. He himself had said earlier in the document that governments should not be overthrown for light or transient causes. So, as many of us probably would, Jefferson turned to the age-old strategy of exaggeration. To be clear, it is not just us today looking back trying to place the source of some of Jefferson's allegations. Those at the time were equally confused on some of the counts. Among the biggest critics of the Declaration was none other than our old friend and Albany Plan supporter, Thomas Hutchinson. Hutchinson was quick to denounce many of the allegations being made by Jefferson as being exceptionally trivial in nature, so much so that they didn't really matter. Hutchinson, to be fair, had a point here. Many of the allegations being made by Jefferson were clear exaggerations, if not outright misrepresentations. For example, one of the allegations reads as follows. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. This is true to some degree. Recall that in Massachusetts, the Assembly had been forced to move out of Boston and to Salem as a function of the Intolerable Acts. Years before, under Hutchinson, the Assembly had relocated from Boston to Cambridge. Either way, neither of these locations, especially Cambridge, were really that distant, unusual, nor uncomfortable. Really, though, this was far from being a common thing either, and was mostly just focused on Massachusetts. In this case, although it was true that the king had relocated one of the assemblies, it was hardly to any unusual or uncomfortable locations. In another example, Jefferson lists, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. Jefferson was citing here to the Administration of Justice Act from 1774, which did allow for those charged with treason to be shipped back to England for trial. Except, it had never happened. Sure, it was possible. Lots of things were possible. But nobody had ever been transported across the Atlantic for trial. This is not to say that everything Jefferson listed in this section was him grasping at straws or exaggerating. Much of this section did contain very legitimate concerns that we have talked about at length throughout our episodes on the imperial crisis. Charges were leveled at the king for quartering, attacking and burning their towns, sending over an army of German mercenaries, and, of course, for taxing the colonists without their consent. These were real complaints that the colonists had been voicing for a considerable amount of time. With the questions of burnt towns and an approaching army of mercenaries, there is something of a chicken versus egg argument. These two actions were in response to the outbreak of hostilities. However, regardless of these being reactionary, they were real complaints of the colonists, and it is hard to argue that they weren't legitimate. In our next episode, when we discuss how everybody would react to the Declaration, we are going to spend more time looking at the criticisms to this section. Jefferson would then wrap the document up by stating its final purpose and proposing that, as the representatives of the United States of America, that they rejected the authority of King George III. Jefferson laid out that the colonies should be treated as an independent and sovereign country, with all the rights and powers which that entails. Jefferson swore all this to the sacred honor of himself and his fellow delegates. With that, the United Colonies had morphed into the United States. Taking Jefferson's lead, I'm going to use this moment, 145 episodes into this podcast, to make the transition in the language. We are done dealing with the colonies. From this point forward, we are dealing with the states. One of the most interesting things to notice about the Declaration of Independence is a very specific term that is conspicuously absent. The entire imperial crisis, and even the beginning of the actual war, had seen the fingers being pointed at Parliament, not the king. In fact, the monarch had largely been off limits until relatively recently, with common sense really kicking off the attacks on the monarchy itself. Prior to this, Americans had been busy for well over a decade, spamming the king with petitions and complaints about Parliament. Yet, the Declaration never actually makes any mention of Parliament. The entire document is pointing the finger very directly at the king, and at nobody else. So the obvious question becomes, what gives? Why did Jefferson completely omit Parliament, a body that had been the bane of the colonists' existence for well over a decade, from the Declaration? As it turns out, Jefferson had not forgotten about Parliament, but rather it was a decision to better frame his argument. By 1776, there was no hope of reconciliation, short of the colonies being given their own separate parliament. There could never really be proportional representation of the American colonies in Parliament. Logistically, the colonies were on a path whereby they would eventually demand a majority of the representation in Parliament, something that was simply never going to be allowed. Nor, by the outbreak of hostilities, was it something that the colonists even wanted. The Declaration failing to ever actually say the word Parliament is a deliberate decision to make clear that the colonists do not recognize the British Parliament as having any valid authority over them. Throughout the entire Declaration, only once are they even alluded to, when Jefferson writes that the king and others subjected them to a jurisdiction foreign to their constitution. Beyond this mention of otherwise unspecified others, there is never a mention of parliamentary authority. This does, to some extent, seem somewhat disingenuous, something that the critics of the Declaration were quick to point out. The colonies for years consented to the actions of Parliament. Throughout the entire imperial crisis, the colonists had been throwing their hands up in anger over parliamentary action. Now, however, Jefferson chose to completely discount that authority, as though it had never existed. By this logic, if Parliament never had authority to begin with, then the colonies only needed to announce their separation from the sovereign. This brings us to a question of exactly who Jefferson was writing the Declaration of Independence for. Was it meant for the citizens of the United States? Was it for the king and the subjects back in Great Britain, informing them of their exit? Was it for the foreign powers who could potentially be new allies to the new nation? As Pauline Maier points out, the question of audience isn't exactly easy to decipher. The evidence largely suggests that foreign governments and potential allies, specifically the French, were the intended audience. However, the actions of the delegates following the passage on July 4th suggest otherwise. Congress was downright slow at getting the Declaration across the Atlantic. By the time that it arrived in France for the American minister, Silas Deane, to present to the French court, it had already been floating around for nearly 2 months. In fact, the first matter of business was getting the declaration out to the states and their legislatures, as well as getting broadsides printed by John Dunlap for dissemination amongst the leadership of the Continental Army. Although we give Jefferson the lion's share of the credit for drafting the Declaration, and to be sure it is something that was very clearly written by him, he was not the only one to work on it. There was, after all, the Committee of Five, of which Jefferson was only a single member, albeit the main one. Editing the document largely fell into the hands of John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. Franklin had returned in 1775, after spending the previous 18 years in London. From the time of his return, he had been of the mind that independence was both necessary and inevitable, and had been busy crafting the Articles of Confederation. Luckily for Franklin, he already had the framework laying around in the form of his old Albany Plan from back in 1754. It required some tweaking, of course. The Articles of Confederation did not envision the colonies as being part of the British Empire, as the Albany Plan had. But it was at least a start. Well, debates over the eventual central government of the soon-to-be United States would drag on. Franklin would be named to the Committee of Five. Suffering from gout, Franklin had little to do with the initial draft. Of course, being a printer by trade, he had no lack of experience being an editor. However, with the Declaration, by all accounts, he treated it with a very light touch, choosing only to make a few small changes in language as he went. Franklin appears to have only made 5 or so edits to the document. Somewhat surprisingly, John Adams, who is, John Adams, only made 1 or 2 edits to the Declaration. Later in life, Adams would become more critical of Jefferson's work on the Declaration. However, at the time, he appears to have had little to say on the matter, at least so far as Jefferson's drafting went. Despite some later criticisms in his old age, the task of getting the Declaration through Congress was going to fall upon the shoulders of Adams. If it was Jefferson who possessed the talent with writing, he was never regarded by anybody as being a particularly talented orator. John Adams, on the other hand, did possess this talent. On June 28th, a few days ahead of schedule, Thomas Jefferson delivered a draft of the Declaration. Beginning on July 1st, the task fell to John Adams to get it through the Congress. Throughout the history of the United States, including the colonial period, there have been very few times that everybody has been in agreement on a subject. Now, generally, that is not that big of a problem. However, when it came to the Declaration, it was significantly more concerning. A colony voting against independence would expose a weakness to the British. It would inform them of where the colonies could be divided. Now, we know from last time that throughout May and June, many of the colonies had gone ahead and given the green light to their delegations to go ahead and approve independence. However, there did remain a handful of colonies where the answer was less clear. Delaware, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, and New York were all less than clear on their positions. In all of those colonies, it was not as though there was widespread rejection of the idea of independence. However, in all the cases, there were rifts between the delegates. None of these is more well known than that of the Pennsylvania delegation, where John Dickinson and Robert Morris still resisted. July 1st began with the President of Congress, John Hancock, reading the motion by Richard Henry Lee from the previous month. Promptly, they decided to move to a vote on the matter. John Dickinson rose to his feet, and the debates began. Dickinson was anything but delusional. He was well aware that independence was an inevitability. His argument, however, continued to hinge on the idea that the time for declaring independence was not right. He did not believe that words on paper were going to sway anybody to the patriot cause, and indeed thought that the only way that they could secure America the alliances that she needed was victory in the field. What Dickinson argued was that until that point, it was better to wait and leave open the chance of reconciliation and a redress of their grievances, rather than burning those bridges with no tangible benefit. None of this was new territory for Dickinson. He had spent much of the last month shouting these exact points. After what was a long and seemingly awkward silence, John Adams stood to address the speech by Dickinson. Adams argued that independence was the only path towards peace and prosperity for the colonies. Adams spoke for more than 2 hours, and although he, like Dickinson, did not cover any new ground or propose novel arguments, the speech is often considered the greatest of his entire career. On the evening of the 1st, a non-binding vote was taken to assess the situation. South Carolina voted against independence. However, they had made it known that if everybody else gets on board, so too would they. Pennsylvania, unsurprisingly, voted against independence. New York had decided that, while they were not going to vote for independence, neither would they vote against it, and agreed to abstain, which in the moment was good enough. Finally, Delaware was at a deadlock. For Delaware, the deciding vote was going to be up to Caesar Rodney, who, unfortunately, was still at home sick. The other 9 colonies voted for independence. The next morning, July 2nd, the official vote was to be held. Overnight, the apparently very sick Caesar Rodney had dragged himself to Philadelphia, where he broke the deadlock. Delaware was voting for separation. South Carolina likewise had decided on the night of the 1st to officially endorse independence. New York was maintaining its position of abstaining from the vote, leaving Pennsylvania as the final holdout. The Pennsylvania delegation was divided with 3 of his 7 members in favor of separation, with the other 4 members being opposed. The colonies were going to vote in favor of independence on July 2nd. John Dickinson was well aware of this. Knowing that the vote was not going to go his way, but unwilling to shift his own position, Dickinson instead decided upon a third option, understanding that independence was now inevitable, and that it was going to happen on the 2nd. Dickinson turned his focus to the fact that in this vote, unanimity was going to be required. No colony could vote against independence without endangering the whole of the United Colonies. With that, both he and Robert Morris decided to skip the morning vote and be absent from Congress. Their absence meant that of the remaining 5 members of the Pennsylvania delegation, 3 of them were voting for separation, hence securing the delegation's vote. New York would join the party late, and on July 15th it would switch its vote to one in favor of independence. John Dickinson has, in the popular memory, long stood as something of the villain in the debates on independence. It is not hard to get the idea that Dickinson was a loyalist. However, this is unfair to the man. Dickinson had long been an advocate for American rights. Sure, he did not think that independence was the path for that, at least not in the manner that it came, but he was absolutely a champion of the patriot cause. Following the vote for independence, with his personal reputation tarnished, Dickinson would end up taking up the call to arms and focusing on military matters, serving as the captain of the 1st Philadelphia Battalion of Associators. It is worth a mention that Robert Morris, like Dickinson, would also be absent on the morning of the vote, though he has managed to escape the criticism that has long haunted Dickinson. This may well be in part because Morris would actually end up signing the Declaration, despite not actually voting for it. I will also mention that this is not the last time that we will hear from John Dickinson, as he will again be back when we reach the debates on the Constitution. Although Congress had agreed on independence, there remained work to do. Specifically, they still had to vote on the Declaration itself. The vote on the second had confirmed that separation was going to happen. It, however, did not approve the Declaration of Independence as the document to accomplish that end. Immediately following the vote for independence, Congress moved on to considering the Declaration itself. If Adams and Franklin had taken a light touch with the document, the rest of Congress more than made up for it, in a process that was pretty much akin to torture for Thomas Jefferson. Overall, Congress would end up eliminating or modifying about a quarter of the original draft. Among the biggest edits was that in the original draft, Jefferson had included a section blaming George III for the evils of slavery. Delegates, feeling that this went too far for the South and fearing a break in what was still a fragile union, reworded the section to accuse the king of exciting domestic insurrections against us. Likewise, as historian Woody Holton points out, the final draft was more religious in nature than the original draft, as mentions of rights being endowed by their creator and a plea to the Supreme Judge were added. Interestingly, in the Jefferson draft, he had referred to George III as being His Present Majesty, something that Congress would rewrite, calling him the present King of Great Britain. It was a much more disconnected term, which tends to lend itself better to the idea that the United States was now a foreign nation. As historian Woody Holton concludes, one of the most important edits that was done was clarifying that the United States was choosing to dissolve the political bonds that had bound them to Great Britain. In this statement, they are altering the memory of what the relationship had been. In the eyes of the new nation, they had always enjoyed these rights. The bonds that they were severing were never more than a political alliance that had been maintained between the English and the colonies. Regardless of the question over if this was actually true, it served the purpose of creating a narrative that the United States had always been sovereign, and that the previous relationship with Great Britain was strictly voluntary. After 3 days of modifications and debates, the task was done. On July 4th, 1776, the delegates in Philadelphia approved the Declaration of Independence. John Adams had written days before that he believed that July 2nd, the day of the vote for independence, would end up being a day of celebration for the states. As it turns out, he was 2 days off. I want to finish up for today by strongly recommending the book American Scripture by Pauline Maier, whom I had mentioned several times today. I leaned very heavily on it today and really only scratched the surface of her analysis. When you look at other works covering this period, so many of them are citing back to Maier's work in American Scripture that it is almost impossible to avoid her scholarship on the subject. If you have an interest in the era, check it out. You won't be disappointed. Next time, we are going to spend our time looking at how the citizens of the new United States reacted to independence, while at the same time looking at the response abroad. All of this was happening at the moment when everybody was holding their breath for the return of General Howe and the beginning of the Battle of New York. Until then, I hope you all have a wonderful 2 weeks. I hope that you are staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you back here next time as news of the Declaration of Independence spreads.